Feminist Frequency talks about how women are depicted in the media, but if there's one thing her critics want to make very clear, it's that men have it bad as well. In fact, this was by far the most common response to Feminist Frequency.
The main reason I don't like you, and the main reason I don't like feminism in general, is because you don't take a single glance at the other side.
The other problem I really have with her is she really only focuses on female issues.
And how do I know that you're a fucking sexist? Well, here's the idea. How come you haven't focused on the male stereotypes of video games and fucking cartoons and shows as well?
If you're going to say that gaming is defacing women and putting them down to a stereotypical look at my tits, then you cannot have shirtless men in games. You cannot have guys shooting big guns because that obviously shows, yes, the package, yes. You can't show that.
And why not just make the argument that male characters are just as sexually and physically objectified in video games as female characters?
Never mind the fact that men are also objectified in these games as well.
The fighting fuck toy, well, like I said, it goes both ways.
It's also very funny how in your mind, when something paints a woman in a negative manner, you classify it as a trope, such as in the Santa Baby song we mentioned earlier. But when it's a man painted negatively, you don't refer to it as a negative stereotype. In your mind, it seems to be genuine.
Few words to this feminist. If you ever took a chance to look at the men's side of things, you'll probably have a better point, and I probably wouldn't even make this video anymore.
They don't know that it's actually worse for men. Most people on YouTube agree that it's worse for men. If you actually watch, if you actually just look at both sides with an open mind, you'll see it's worse for men.
Now, wouldn't a straight, white male who needs to loosen up and enjoy life also be a trope? Wouldn't that also be a sexist stereotype?
I would partially agree with that, but I would also agree that this film is sexist towards men as well.
They just don't listen. They don't care about the rights of men, what men think. They just don't give a fuck.
As Feminist Frequency goes on her rants about commercials that are sexist towards women and ironic sexism, she finds no time to comment on this objectification of men in these commercials.
I maintain that condemning males' idealization of women, while entirely ignoring the idealization of men in female material, is not only sexist and intellectually dishonest, but painfully hypocritical.
So ultimately, sexism in games is there, but it affects both sides. Women like Anita Sarkeesian are only attempting to look at one side of the coin without flipping it over and examining both sides equally.
But let's look on the opposite side. What about the male tropes in video games?
Have you ever noticed that, with a few notable exceptions, basically all male characters in video games fall into a small handful of cliches and stereotypes?
Notice how men are also sexualized too?
Yes, she is right. There is a problem with sexism in video games, but there is also a problem in that guys get it just as bad in video games as well, which again, I don't think she's ever acknowledged.
And even if it were true, it would still go both ways. This is what I mean by biased. She only talks about the sexism of women in all these products such as movies, Legos, and freaking Christmas songs. And she tries to portray men as some kind of angry misogynist.
It's worth noting that in academia, women's studies is now called gender studies to reflect the fact that masculinity is the subject of study as well. Simply look at books on sites like Amazon and you can find numerous texts on the subject. It's also worth asking whether or not Anita has ever given her opinions on these sorts of issues or ever talked about men. With that, I give you the following collection of Feminist Frequency clips.
These commercials directed at boys value competition, being in control, having power, and conquering and commanding. Those values restrict the acceptable options for what boys are allowed to express emotionally. I've yet to see a commercial where boys are nurturing or caring. They're limited in examples of how to react to problems and how to solve conflicts. They're taught to fight, to be competitive, and to be aggressive. I often talk about women's representations in popular culture, but I think it's important that we talk about men and masculinity as well. To paraphrase Bell Hooks, men aren't oppressed or exploited by sexism, but they do suffer as a result of it. Advertisers spend billions of dollars annually to make sure that audiences consciously and unconsciously feel an emotional desire to buy their products. This means that male representations often are of sexist jerks, and liquor ads are a great example of this. Hey men, according to television, all you have to do to get the ladies is pretend to be emotional. you know, instead of actually expressing honest emotion. Advertisers attempt to convince men that manipulation is the only way to engage with women, and this leaves women represented as oblivious and totally unaware of the deceit. I mean, it would be totally ridiculous to maybe, like, communicate honestly. These ads are clearly telling men that it's okay to manipulate women in order to get what they want. If men aren't learning how to manipulate women, they're learning that women exist to be displayed, judged, and evaluated.
Guys never change. Neither do we. Jim Beam, the bourbon since 1795.
Guys never change, and neither does the offensive advertising. Liquor ads take the worst possible masculine traits, repackage it, and sell it right back to them, continuing this cycle of sexist socialization. It is a control mythology, a story which assumes that this behavior is natural and will never change. It promotes and encourages men to continue this behavior and creates an environment where women have no choice but to accept it. In our current patriarchal society, however, traits associated with men and masculinity are more highly valued, even ones that aren't exactly the most socially beneficial. In this case, LEGO has strongly emphasized combat and violent conflict in order to market to boys. This marketing choice has a further consequence of limiting boys because they miss out on toys that help develop cooperation, relationship building, nurturing, and caregiving. Meanwhile, these positive values are almost entirely absent in toys aimed at boys. The repercussions of this can be grave, relegating the responsibility for fostering healthy relationships and communications on women, and simultaneously reinforcing to boys and men that using violence is a practical option for solving conflicts, even interpersonal ones. And just so we're absolutely clear, I'm not saying men's stories aren't good, important, or interesting, but I just want to point out that they are disproportionately valued and most rewarded in our society.
Apparently she does talk about men, and it seems what she's trying to say is that the media messages teach men to be emotionally stunted, sexist, violent cannon fodder. With the idea that feminist frequency never talks about men laid to rest, let's examine this idea of male stereotypes a little bit closer. I've saved this video for last for two reasons. First, because it was by far the most common response, and second, because taken in the light of all the arguments used against feminist frequency up to this point, it's difficult to take this objection seriously.
You're treated as complete equals. It's like you wanted to be treated better than men. That's your goal in this, is to be treated better than men. And I thought what you wanted was equality.
Women are not oppressed in any way in the United States.
You see, men and women already have equality, and women are not oppressed in any way, therefore it follows logically that men are not oppressed in any way. What more do you men want? Do you want to be treated better than women?
If you want a real example of women being downtrodden in terms of human rights and low self-esteem, look at countries where feminists like Anita never speak about, such as Saudi Arabia.
If you want a real example of men's rights being violated, how about we talk about the countries that men's rights activists never speak of? Countries in Africa where young boys are taken and forced to be child soldiers. How about we talk about that instead?
There are more important issues facing women today that need to be addressed than their hypersensitivity to trivial first world problems.
There are more important issues facing men than trivial first world problems, like how men are depicted in video games.
The two problems that I have with the channel are that, one, a lot of the issues aren't really important issues, I guess you could say. And the other problem I really have with her is she really only focuses on female issues.
Yeah, what you're talking about, it's not really that important, it's kind of trivial, but, I mean, while you're talking about those oh-so unimportant things, could you also talk about the unimportant things involving men as well?
You see, men, boys, tend to like one thing, and women and girls tend to like another thing.
And that somehow companies are responsible for the differences in males and females when all they're doing is marketing to the established principles of male and female differences.
This is just the way it is. I mean, men's problems, they're natural. That's the way it is. That's the way men are. It's natural. It's all natural. Explains it all away.
No, I think the advertisers are probably thinking something like, will this shit sell this shit? If it does, that is good. If it doesn't, then we have failed, etc. They're probably not into the whole moralizing thing.
I mean, why would they even care about how men appear in video games? It's just, they're trying to make money. They don't care about morality. So who cares if these men in video games are unrealistic standards? It's money. The money.
It's been like that since fucking forever.
I mean, really, why attempt to solve any problem? Because it's always been this way. These problems have always been around. So, I mean, male problems are sort of irrelevant because that's the way it's always been, right?
Not only do we play them because of that, but we want to be somebody else. We're not happy with the way our lives are. We want to escape, just like you read a good book to escape, or you watch a movie to escape, or a TV show to escape. It's all escapism.
If the hero is chasing after a sexy woman, I could relate to that. I could project my own desire for being with that sexy woman on the video game character because I paid my $60. And that goes for comic books too.
Yeah, I mean, these might not be accurate depictions of males, they might be exaggerated beyond any recognition, and no man could possibly live up to it, but, I mean, it's escapism. That's what we want to be. That's our fantasy. That's what we project ourselves to be. So why change any of that? So why should anyone care about the trivial first world problems of men when it's just corporations making a profit, giving men what they want, and men doing what comes naturally to them? In isolation, the point that men also face certain social problems particular to men is a valid issue, but in the context of arguing against feminism, it amounts to little more than self-defeating obscurantism. In order to take this idea seriously, we would have to concede certain points which would make feminism and feminist frequency seem far more reasonable than her haters are comfortable with. Points such as that society shapes us, that societal views have an effect on people, that stereotypes can be a bad thing, that profit can have a negative social cost, that gender is not something bound by nature, that men and women might be political equals but still face problems capable of being addressed and hence feminism might still be relevant, etc. The sum of the arguments against feminist frequency depict the status quo as both natural and desirable.
It is a control mythology, a story which assumes that this behavior is natural and will never change. It promotes and encourages...
Okay, we get it. But if people want to seriously address men's issues, then they must admit at a minimum that there's something wrong with the status quo. Ironically, many anti-feminists end up becoming a parody of feminism by pointing out gender stereotypes and beliefs in the media and society at large, but with a twist that they examine views of men. This is in part because the social critiques second-wave feminism is founded on can be taken in more directions than just how society views women. So both feminists and anti-feminists end up drawing on the same methods of social critique to make their points. Perhaps these groups have less reason to be at odds than they think. Also, do video games objectify men?
One way to think about damseled characters is via what's called the subject-object dichotomy. In the simplest terms, subjects act, and objects are acted upon. The subject is the protagonist, the one who the story is centered on, and the one doing most of the action. In video games, this is almost always the main playable character, and the one from whose perspective most of the story is seen. So the damsel trope typically makes men the subject of narratives, while relegating women to the role of object. This is a form of objectification because as objects, damseled women are being acted upon, most often becoming or reduced to a prize to be won, a treasure to be found, or a goal to be achieved.
It would seem that objectification is simply not the right way to describe it. Men are the subject, and women are the object. Lastly, I have this clip.
If anything's sexist, it's okay if a girl wears fucking blue, but if a guy wears pink, it's all of a sudden fucking girly. It's okay if a girl has long hair or short hair, but as soon as a guy has long hair, that makes the guy a fucking girl. Shut the hell up. No. You can't say everything is sexist. People are sexist towards guys and girls. That's the way it works.
Let's examine these social attitudes carefully for a moment. What he's saying is that men are more harshly punished for crossing the gender line than women are. Does this mean that men have it worse than women? Or does this example reveal something about the level of misogyny in our culture? Note the fact that in these examples, the very concept of being female is used to insult men. These insults indicate a value system in which men and masculinity are more valued than females and femininity. Any man that deviates from gender boundaries is put down with insults attacking his masculinity, and female is used to imply inferior. Could there be any clearer case of misogyny in action? Well, it may certainly be true that not every problem in the world is exclusive to women. Any honest examination of the value system operating in our society would show that most feminists, even the ones like Feminist Frequency, are not as crazy as people would like to believe they are. Some people would like to say anything to try and show other people to be wrong, even if it makes their own position indefensible. Perhaps the takeaway message here is that a society with rigid gender roles is not particularly good for anyone except for maintaining a certain system of power and the elites that benefit from that system. In a sense, men's problems and women's problems are not all that different. Finally, one more interesting way to put all of this into perspective is to compare what Feminist Frequency said about men to the arguments that have already been presented to explain away sexism in the media. One common issue that's taken to be a men's rights issue is the male-only draft in the United States. Now, on one hand, you have people holding to the belief that men naturally gravitate towards certain roles while women naturally gravitate towards others. On the other hand, you have people such as Feminist Frequency that believe that gender is a social construct and that men are taught aggressive and warlike behavior by society. You could extrapolate further from that to a society which uses men for war and combat by raising them for this role from an early age. The reason that we have a male-only draft is not because of the actions of some feminist conspiracy to keep men down, but rather because of our society's beliefs about the way men naturally are. Our society has a binary worldview in which people are divided into genders, and those genders are assigned certain abstract characteristics which all people are supposed to possess based on their gender. This dualistic thinking, which is seen throughout concepts like religion, reduces the complexity of reality and of human beings into abstractions. This in turn imposes certain abstract expectations on people, and in various ways everyone suffers as a consequence. But again, throughout this series, we have seen people double down on the notion that men and women are naturally certain ways for the sake of contradicting what Feminist Frequency is saying. If men naturally are a certain way, then it becomes easy to explain away men's problems in the exact same flippant fashion which people are responding to Feminist Frequency. If you are actually concerned with men's problems, then stop throwing around statistics and start asking yourself why things are the way they are.
When Simone released her list in 1999, there was an instant backlash from some comic book fans who thought it was unfair that they were singling out female characters. This criticism happens whenever we point out tropes specifically about women. In this case, comic book fans criticized women in refrigerators by saying that male heroes get killed and tortured too, so what's the big deal? The people who run the Women in Refrigerators website responded to this by creating another trope. How much do I love fans? Called Dead Men Defrosting. Comic fan John Bartle explains, in cases where male heroes have been altered or appear to die, they usually come back even better than before, either power-wise or in terms of character development relevancy to the reader. In response to the Bechdel test, I'm often asked, well, what about the reverse? Why isn't there a test to determine if two men talk to each other about something other than a woman? The answer to that is simple. The test is meant to indicate a problem, and there isn't a problem with a lack of men interacting with one another. The Bechdel test is useful because it can point out an institutional pattern, and since there's no problem with men and men's stories being underrepresented in films, the reverse test is useless and irrelevant.
This is the end of my series. I hope you have enjoyed it.